He completed an internship in medicine and a residency in clinical pathology at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, fellowship training in transfusion medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital. And he is currently a transfusion medicine physician, medical director of the Stem Cell Processing Laboratory, and the vice chair for medical education in the Department of Pathology at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School. And his primary academic focus is medical education. So we were, of course, thrilled that he was available to join us for this lecture series on clinical trials methodology. And he's going to be speaking to us on avoiding bias, critically reviewing manuscripts, including your own. And very much looking forward to this. So, Rich, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. When I heard about this opportunity, it's great. I love working with my colleagues from Canada, and they've helped me a lot actually learn how to evaluate or try to evaluate the literature. So let me share my screen and try to get going. Okay. Let me just hide some stuff. There we go. All right, so yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about critically reviewing manuscripts, because if you know how to critically review someone else's manuscript, you can probably do your own and be able to avoid bias and other issues with your paper. So just a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not claiming I'm God's gift to reviewing papers, but just to give a little some of the things I've learned over time. And also I apologize, or I'll just say, I'll say in advance, I apologize if I'm critiquing one of your papers and you take it, it's not meant in any way to be offensive. It's just to promote discussion. I'd be totally welcome to hear other people's thoughts. So nothing to disclose. So another way to phrase this is there's a lot of garbage out there with the medical literature. So this is just a paper. I actually think I got it from Dr. Callum, listing, all the zillion types of bias that can occur in a paper. There's even something new from Oxford called a catalog of bias. I happened to do a search and they list all these biases on the web. So there's a lot of potential. And caveat lector is reader beware, okay? And again, there is a lot of garbage out there. So here's just an example. It's gotten so bad, there are even studies about how bad the literature is. There's literature on how bad the literature is. Let's put it that way. So as I'm sure some of you know, a primary outcome is very important to decide on up front, because otherwise people can play games, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this was just a study, and they looked at 389 trials with clear primary outcomes prospectively described. 33% had at least one primary outcome change, including omission or not reporting a registered primary outcome or publication of a new outcome. And that is a big red flag. When people change the primary outcome, it can mean a lot of things, including they're playing games. Another more recent is there was a review published in Transfusion this year, Whole Blood and Civilian Transfusion Practice, a review of the literature. So here is a quote. One of the landmark randomized controlled trials involved X number of trauma patients who received emergency release blood products, of which 840 were transfused with at least 1 unit of low titer O whole blood. Problem is, for people familiar with this literature, there is no randomized controlled trial of whole blood. It was an observational study, yet it was called a randomized controlled trial in this review. There were 12 authors and presumably peer reviewed. So this managed to get by everybody. So they eventually, months later, published corrections. And they also found four other papers in this study that were cited as randomized that were actually observational. So again, I'm not saying all papers are bad, but it doesn't matter what journal it's in. There can be real problems with the literature, and part of it is sort of arming ourselves to learn how to look at other papers, which helps us look at our own papers. So that gets to our objectives: critically review papers to identify potential pitfalls. And one clear message: you don't need to, I'm not a statistician. You don't need to be a statistician to be able to critically review on many levels these papers. And then using this knowledge, avoid the same mistakes and bias in your own studies. Basically, be your own critical reviewer. So what I want to talk about is first a little bit of a toolkit, certain points about trial design, confounders, cause and effect, secondary outcomes, and power calculations. And then we're going to go through some studies, particularly in the trauma literature, to point out examples of how you can sort of quickly go through some of these papers. And then we'll talk a little bit about unconscious bias or bias related to issues with race and ethnicity in the literature. So again, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to do this or a statistician. And again, go into these things not trusting what you're reading. And hallelujah if everything makes sense. But go in, and that even yourself, because we all have biases. I have people read my papers who aren't even involved in the research sometimes, just because I want to make sure I'm not missing something. But still, it helps if you think about these things as you're writing a paper or doing your own studies. So throughout, maybe some of you had a chance to look at some of these papers beforehand. I'm going to put up some red flags where I'm going to ask you guys maybe in the chat to say, hey, what do you think the problem is here? And then, okay, so let's start with the toolkit. All right. Very important to read the methods. And many of you probably know this already. There are two kind of major observational studies. A cohort can be prospective or retrospective, or a case control. In a case control, you're dividing by the outcome, for example, whether the patient survived or died. And then you're going to look to see, when you have those two groups, if there's any differences, for example, in the use of pre-hospital transfusion in a trauma setting. The case controls are primarily used when there's a rare outcome. So most of the studies we'd be looking at in trauma are cohort studies. And there you start by dividing by the exposure, whether they received, for example, whether they received pre-hospital blood versus didn't. And then you divide by that, and then you compare whether there's a difference in survival. So then you have randomized controlled trials where are basically set up like a cohort, except you randomize to those exposures. And there are two major types. There's your standard kind of randomized controlled trial where you randomize each individual. And then there are cluster randomized trials. And we'll be talking a little bit more about those later and some of the pitfalls. Okay, related to the trust no one and read things carefully. This was a paper published in 2003 about CMV and using leukoreduction reduction to prevent it. So you read the abstract. We followed a prospective cohort of 807 CMV seronegative stem cell transplant recipients who underwent CMV testing. Oh, a prospective cohort. That's nice. But then you look at the next paragraph. We recently noted an increase in the incidence of transfusion-transmitted CMV that appeared to be correlated with the utilization of apheresis platelet products. As such, we thought to determine if the incidence of transfusion-transmitted CMV had changed over time. What is the red flag here? Especially in relation. Say that again. Sorry. Or if you want to put it in the chat, and maybe Jacob, if you could look, if anyone's writing anything. All right. Well, there's clearly an
Jacob,
issue.
you're on mute.
Sorry, I actually hit the video to the mute button. Just asking everyone to just mute your lines. Just because I think there was some background sound there while Rich was presenting. Thanks, everyone.
All right. So any clue what's the problem here? Well, they say it's a prospective cohort, yet they noted an increase in incidence recently. And then they looked at two time periods, one before this change in utilization of apheresis products, and then a second period. So there is no way this can be a prospective trial, which means starting from day one, you're separating the patients into two separate cohorts before you've even started the study. So unless they have a time machine, this is a retrospective study. So it's an example of this was published in Blood, good journal, but they're saying they did a prospective study when it is literally impossible on it's impossible that this was a prospective study. So that's just one example of, again, why it's really critical to read the methods. Another thing with looking at the methods is how do they control for confounders? So in observational studies, is the exposure causal? Or is it related to another factor that is causal, a confounder? So for example, there's a lot of studies in observational study, a lot of observational studies that vitamins prevent cancer. However, a confounder is people taking vitamins overall have a healthier lifestyle, and that's why they're having lower cancer. And in fact, when they've done randomized trials with vitamins preventing cancer, they don't show a benefit. And the nice thing about a randomized trial is, in general, it should help balance confounders. But just like anything, if it's small, especially if it's a small study, there might be imbalances in the groups. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the cluster trials. A good example in transfusion is there's tons of studies out there saying transfusion causes badness. You get transfused, you get cancer, you get, I don't know, obviously you die, you have all this. The problem is people getting transfusion are sicker. So there's a huge confounder there. And you'd be surprised how many studies don't control for that confounder. And there are possible tools that you can use to control for these. Probably the most common is multivariable analysis. You can only do stratifications for a small number. So anyway, a little bit about multivariable analysis at my non-statistician level. So basically, when you talk about linear regression analysis, you're saying you've created a formula, a line, based on an outcome and a variable. So y equals mx plus b. So for example, for your study you're doing, you could have as the outcome deaths at 24 hours. And then there might be a linear regression model with the variable based on age, for example. As the people get older, they're more likely to have death at 24 hours. And what you can do when they talk about multivariable analysis is like putting this in multidimensional space. So you still have the same outcome, but you can have different slopes or different slopes and things like that to adjust for things like age, minutes of injury to rescue, whatever. So you basically can create a whole linear formula or a formula that accounts for each variable, and then you can subtract out those variables to see the pure effect of your variable, a single variable, on the outcome. And you can continue to add variables. The rule of thumb is you need 10 events per variable. And you can also include categorical variables like, were they male or female or stuff like that. But again, the model, this is really important. The model is only as good as the variables included. So if you're looking at a transfusion study and they didn't include how sick the patients are, then that's a bad study. And you don't have to be a statistician to be able to figure that out. Also, multivariable analysis is not magic. If two groups are so different, you cannot change an apple into an orange. You cannot magically change something. If there are so many differences, you just cannot create a good enough model to account. It's very difficult to do that. So here's another example of a study where you have to look very carefully. So this was a study, risk factors for hemorrhage after liver biopsy. And here's the multivariable analysis. Is there anything that comes up in this multivariable analysis that catches your eye as significant in causing bleeding?
Well, Rich, they all look like they're significant, in terms of the p-value and looking at the odds ratios all being greater than 1.0.
Right, but look at this one.
Mm-hmm.
You think giving them a platelet transfusion caused them to bleed?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this tells me their model is crap, basically, right? Excuse me, I know this is being recorded, so sorry, it's lousy. If giving a platelet transfusion comes up as significant in their multivariable analysis, that very strongly argues that you can't explain how a platelet transfusion could cause bleeding. which means they haven't adequately controlled for things like how sick the patient was and things like that. So this shows evidence of, again, that the multivariable model probably wasn't adequately controlled for. Okay. Next thing is, again, talking about cause and effect, because the idea, like there, I can say that giving a platelet transfusion did not cause them to bleed. So there's a problem with the model. And I'm not going to say if I remove giving platelet transfusions, well, that's a whole other issue, removing platelet. But the idea is, well, definitely removing platelet transfusions shouldn't lower the risk of having bleeding during a liver biopsy. It's not really a cause and effect. So I'm guessing most of you believe smoking causes lung cancer. So this should be one people can put in the chat. Can anyone tell me why you believe smoking causes lung cancer? Because there's never been a randomized trial. Okay, so much for my goal. Oh, oh, good. There's a few. Excellent. Where are they, Jacob?
So we have the more you smoke, the higher your risk of cancer.
Right.
Lots of case control trials, biologic plausibility, and observational studies. This is all the evidence that people are aware of creates this link.
Right. So what people just mentioned were actually characteristic of parts of the Hill criteria. So Hill was one of the statisticians who worked on one of the initial studies showing smoking causes lung cancer. And it was actually in doctors, which is fairly amusing. But he said, this was an observational study. How do I know it's truly cause and effect? What are the things I can look at to really make that connection? And you guys listed, but these are things as you're looking, especially in observational studies, is there the connection? So one thing is consistency, which was kind of meant. There's a lot of studies out there showing smoking leads to lung cancer. You could also argue, they've exposed mice probably to the carcinogens in cigarettes, and they've gotten cancer. Again, a dose response, like was said, the more you smoke, the more likely you are to get lung cancer. Another thing you can look at is reversibility. Do you find that people who stop smoking revert to a lower risk of lung cancer? And that's true as well. Plausibility, sure, it's plausible because smoking has carcinogens in it. And then there are a couple of other things, a little, not a little more complex. Analogy, are there examples that fit in a different setting? I look at this like, well, smoking causes cancer for other tissues like, oral cancer and things. So it's consistent. This is fairly obvious, but that it shouldn't be someone got lung cancer and then started smoking. There has to be temporality. And then the strength of the statistical association, how strong is the p-value, how many patients, things like that. So these are all things that you can use when you're looking through the literature. And I always think of the smoking model as a good one when you're looking. And as we go through, some of the trauma studies will apply some of the Hill criteria. Another thing is be really cautious about secondary outcomes in subgroup analysis. If you're using a p-value of 0.05, there's a 5% probability that the result was due to chance. If you do multiple statistical tests, the chance that every test or every subgroup that I look at or secondary outcome, the chance that every one will have a p-value greater than 0.05 is 0.95 to the number of tests. So the chance, if I do, 1 minus 0.95 to the number of tests, will be the chance that one of those subgroup analyses will have a p-value less than 0.05. And if you put in 20 statistical tests, 60%, 65% of the time. So if I do 20 statistical tests on my data, 65% of the time, I'll find one that is less than 0.05. That's why switching the primary outcome is such a big deal, because it can mean they did what's called p-hacking, which means I just kept doing statistical tests on different things until I found a magic one that was less than 0.05. So there is something you can do about this called the Bonferroni correction when you're doing multiple tests. And I'm not saying to ignore secondary outcomes, especially if there's consistent findings or they're very good p-values or things like that, but be very cautious because the more statistical tests you do, the more likely you're going to get a p-value less than 0.05. And then the last sort of part of the toolkit is reviewing the sample size calculation. So for example, if your null hypothesis is patients receiving plasma will not have better 28 days of survival. So type 1 error, or alpha, is saying plasma is better, but it isn't. And that's typically set at 0.05, 5%. So 5% of the time they say plasma is better, but it isn't. Type 2 or beta error is say plasma is better, but it is. Say plasma isn't better, but it is. So I found, oh, no difference with plasma, but oh, it really would have helped. So this is usually set at 20%, and that's where power comes in, which is 1 minus the beta error. And the reason the type 1 error is more strict is if you make a type 2 error, you're just going back to standard of care, what you were doing. If you make a type 1 error, you're going to change practice. So that's why it's usually stricter than a type 2 error. And as you can imagine, because type 2 error is when you have a negative result, but it's really should have found a difference. It's especially important to review the sample size calculation if there's a negative study. And you also need to know the expected control result. So if an outcome is rare, right? If something only happens in 1 in 1,000 patients, if you only have 80 patients in your study, you're clearly not going to be able to find the difference. Also, for continuous outcomes, you need to know the level of variation. Like if it's a creatinine, what's the standard deviation? Okay, so that's a little bit of the toolkit. So now let's go into some studies and try to apply some of this stuff. Okay, and these are the studies we're going to talk about. They're all related to giving pre-hospital blood product support. There's one observational cohort, one randomized trial, and one cluster randomized trial. And again, we're going to trust no one, even if it's supposedly a good journal, which all of these are. Okay, so this was a military study where it's a retrospective cohort where they looked at US military combat casualties during a defined period of time. They were all rescued alive from the point of injury, and they had either traumatic limb amputation or shock. The exposure was initiation of pre-hospital transfusion, red cells, plasma, or both, en route from point of injury to a surgical hospital. And they looked at those who received the pre-hospital transfusion and those who didn't. Okay. So what they did, it's an observational study, so they need to control for confounders. So there was a bunch of confounders. So they called these visible factors, the mechanism of injury, did they have shock, stuff like that. And then they tried, I mentioned maybe multiple variable analysis, but you can try to match people as well. But then further did multivariable analysis on some other things they couldn't match for, okay? Now, at the beginning of the study, they had 502 patients, 55 received pre-hospital transfusion, 447 did not receive pre-hospital transfusion. And of those, they matched 345 to the 55 who received pre-hospital transfusion. So, any concerns from what I just talked about?
I think people sort of mull it over, and I'll read out the chat.
Yeah, sure.
So one came up was, why were the 102 not matched?
Okay, so that's good. What was going on there?
So many people not matched at all.
Yep.
Comment.
So that's true. One of the things that really stands out to me is why there are so many people who received, who didn't receive, like there were only very few people who received pre-hospital transfusion. Why was that? What was the reason only 55 received pre-hospital transfusion? Was there some bias in the decision of the people administering the blood as to who should get it and who should not? So to explain that a little bit more, so their co-primary outcomes were 24-hour mortality and 30-day survival. So again, huge differences. So why were there 8 times more patients in the no transfusion group? So one, they say, well, we weren't sure if everyone could transfuse. So maybe they were evacuated by some helicopters that couldn't transfuse. But how about if the medics knew that transfusion was futile? So they said, I'm not going to even bother transfusing because unfortunately the patient's going to die. So it's kind of like a confounder. They're going to claim that no pre-hospital transfusion means you're going to die. But what about the medic believed transfusion was futile as they knew the patient was going to die? And it wasn't the pre-hospital transfusion that caused them to survive. It was the fact that they didn't get a transfusion because the medic thought it's not even worth it. Okay. So, and it is true, the matching I'm a little less concerned about because they were able to match most of them. And it might just be a few of those didn't fit, although it is always a concern. Why did they even have to match up front? Why didn't they just use multivariable analysis? It shows there are a tremendous number of differences between the two groups up front. And that's sort of what so this is table one, okay? Even if it's a randomized trial, it's critical to look at table one because there could be imbalances between the groups, okay? So what you see here is they have the pre-hospital transfusion recipients, 55, and on the right is the people they match them to, okay? Any red flags you see here?
People are scanning through table one and looking for things.
That's good. And again, we're not keeping score, even if you don't get what I'm getting at.
So time to medevac was flagged as a difference between the two arms.
And I think that is the key difference, the key thing I'm trying to get at here, not even at that level.
Amputation.
There were 10 characteristics with significant differences, even after matching.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then they're like, oh, we did multivariable, right? But 7 of these were not included in the multivariable analysis, including transporting to a facility with a higher level of care, which you think is pretty important, as well as use of tranexamic acid, which randomized trials showed has a benefit in survival. So big problems here. Now, there were similarities on things, but there were still huge differences. So here's the results. Pre-hospital, 37 received only 1 unit of red cells. Some got some plasma, some received both. Okay, so they weren't getting a tremendous amount of blood pre-hospital. So, well, I just gave that one away. It's like how can 1 unit of red cells save someone's life, right? If you're exsanguinating. So they matched in the match group and when they just looked at matched, okay, 3 pre-hospital transfusion recipients died versus 69 non-recipients, okay? So a lot more people died in the non-recipient group. Look at that p-value, right? P equals 0.007. But then they did the multivariable analysis, right? And here you can see, oh my gosh, look at that huge difference between the two groups, right? After adjustment. Any concerns here?
There's been a comment made, as you said, that there's no way that anyone could have been saved by 1 or even a 2 unit red cell transfusion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then what I'm getting at with this second one, we went from a p-value of 0.007 to a p-value of 0.03. And we just mentioned that they didn't control for a couple of pretty important things. So all it would take probably is controlling for a few more confounders and it would go poof. This would no longer be statistically significant anymore. The other thing, a very important thing, is always look at the y-axis. You would think this is a tremendous difference, but it goes from 0 to 12.5%. So not really as huge a difference as you might imagine from the thing. Okay, let's even look more closely at the data. Okay. So within 30 days, so there were 70% of the deaths. Okay. They looked at 30 days were in the first hour after rescue. Okay. That was in 74% of the non-recipients and 17% among the pre-hospital transfusion. So these patients are dying very, very early on. So, and deaths among non-recipients early contribute the most to the between group survival. So people, the non-recipients were dying early. All right. So I will just say this relates to that futility bias, where the sickest people were just saying, I don't want to transfuse because it's unfortunately going to be a waste. Okay. Related to what I talked about earlier. Okay. Then they looked at another outcome. They said only transfusions initiated within 15 minutes of rescue were associated with reduced 24-hour mortality. Okay. This is adjusted. Okay. So this is if they received transfusion within 15 minutes. But the key thing here is there was significant overlap between the pre-hospital versus control. So if you look at the orange, that you can see there were people between 0 and 15 minutes who actually received the transfusions in the hospital. So we've changed our initial outcome. Before we were talking about pre-hospital transfusion. Now we're just talking about early transfusion. Okay. And then they said there was no change if they looked at greater than 15 to 20 minutes. Okay. They do not show other 5-minute intervals. So I'll just do this one. There are huge red flags here. First of all, it was not their primary it wasn't their outcome to look at time. And also, they only looked, how do we know they didn't look at 0 to 5 minutes, 0 to 10 minutes, 0 to 15 minutes? How do we know they didn't just pick a magic time where their p-value was less than 0.02? Also, there's no real dose response. Would I expect that suddenly you hit 16 minutes and no one lives? Right? It doesn't make any sense. It should be the farther you get away from the train. And it should be even better within 5 minutes. You know, there should be some sort of quote unquote dose response here, which we're not seeing. Okay, so these are the same things. Again, I talked about secondary outcomes. Here, transfusion within 15 minutes was different than the initial question. Did they look at earlier time points, but no effect? And there's no dose response. Suddenly at 16 minutes, there's no benefit. Big red flag. So some additional issues. Pre-hospital deaths occurred only among non-recipients. Remember we talked about futile? If you remove 21, so what they did after the fact, you know, they decided finally towards the end of the paper, we're going to remove 21 for quote unquote possible transfusion futility. Loss of vital signs, undetectable vital signs, or ME actually classified as a pre-hospital death. Okay, so when you remove those, they said still reduced 24-hour mortality for transfusion started within 15 minutes. Okay, so it still reached significance, it was P of 0.04. Any problems with this? What else might you be interested in besides transfusion started within 15 minutes? So what I'm getting at here, that was not the primary outcome. The primary outcome was pre-hospital transfusion. So they never did this same futility analysis with what was their original primary outcome, which was pre-hospital transfusion, which removed 21 of the 69 deaths in the non-transfused group. And again, I didn't do the adjustments, but if I do a simple chi-square test, guess what? It's no longer statistically significant anymore, the mortality. So again, this futility bias, I think, is a huge issue in this paper. So getting at that, we'll look at the RCTs. This whole dose response was a secondary outcome, but they really only looked at 2 time points, 0 to 15, like within 15 minutes and 15 to 20 minutes, and it didn't fit a dose response picture. How could one transfusion make such a big difference? It was on the cusp of significance and not controlled for several possible confounders. And I mentioned the futility issues. When they removed the futility, the quote unquote cases they thought futile, they didn't even look at it from the primary outcome. How could a reviewer say you're removing futile patients, but you didn't do it for what you originally claimed was your primary outcome? So to me, there are huge issues with this paper, as you might imagine. Okay, the second study is a randomized controlled trial. This was in an urban setting where they randomized patients to get plasma at the scene of, through an ambulance, patients in hemorrhagic shock. So they gave the paramedics a cooler. And when they opened the cooler, it either had plasma or frozen water. And if they saw the frozen water, they'd give the patient saline. If they saw the plasma, they would give the plasma. And first of all, one thing that was lacking here, they didn't say how many patients they need to assess. If they need to assess 30,000 patients, it shows how, it's hard to find. They might have been too exclusive in their criteria or difficult to implement. But there was minimal dropout of the patients included. Okay, so these were the stuff I had before about the issue with the sample size calculation. So here the primary outcome was mortality within 28 days after injury-free. And they said we calculated 150 patients would provide 80% power to detect minimum difference between groups of 0.5 in INR or something with the TEG. So any concerns about this power calculation?
People are thinking this over.
No, that's cool.
Yeah. So the comment has been made that 0.5 difference in INR is not clinically significant. Someone else has commented that the clinical utility of these differences is questionable.
Exactly. Why are you powering your study based on INR? It makes no sense, right? Also, while they mentioned the type 2 error, I had a lot of trouble. I couldn't find the type 1 error that they mentioned. And then they do say with these parameters and assuming 25% mortality, the study was powered to detect 19 percentage point difference in mortality. So I can't even figure out how they translated this. I think the way it's described in the methods is pretty darn poor. But one thing you can say is 19 percentage points is pretty big. I'd be okay if there was a 10 percentage point difference in mortality. So you could argue up front this study was underpowered to do, so if they got a negative result, it was underpowered to detect that result. Okay, and then table 1, they were pretty similar. There were some differences that perhaps might favor the control group, which I have arrows here. It's about 26 minutes from injury to hospital. And all patients received the 2 units, but some received pre-hospital, some received 1 pre-hospital, 1 in, and 2, some only started pre-hospital, which illustrates some of the problems, right? You want to get people to the hospital quickly. It might be difficult to institute giving them transfusions, but they all received it, but not all pre-transfusion, pre-hospital. And then the final results, there were no differences in the, if anything, it favored the control group. And it was actually stopped early because of fertility. There were only 20% receiving massive transfusion, so it was pretty small. There was faster time to getting a red cell in the control group, maybe because they didn't have to try to figure out how to give a transfusion and they could get them to the hospital quicker. As expected, there was more saline in the control group. There's also this strange INR result where actually the INR was lower in the control group. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, Hill criteria. Well, consistency, not consistent with the cohort study. They didn't see a difference. Dose response, most people did it. So it was hard. It wasn't really truly it was pragmatic because it basically said it's hard to get 2 units in pre-hospital when you're in an urban setting. But they didn't look, was there a difference if they got both pre-hospital, if they got 1 pre-hospital and 1 not? So there was no dose response in that regard. Again, how could 1 or 2 bags of plasma make a difference in someone exsanguinating? Now, the strange INR result, it could just be due to chance or they were sicker. But what's interesting, they said, oh, we expected not much difference in INR because plasma doesn't reduce, is not good at reducing these subtly elevated INRs. But then why did they base the power calculation on INR? If they're admitting it's not a good measure. So it brings up other concerns about the power calculation. It was stopped early. And again, the main thing here is, again, how they used to detect the power, but also it was a 19 percentage point difference, assuming 25% mortality, but the mortality was 10 to 15%. So it was even more underpowered to detect a difference. Because again, if you have few people who reach the outcome, you're less likely to see a difference. So again, this study, the big problem here, it was probably, if there was a difference, it was probably terribly underpowered to detect one. Okay, last study is a cluster randomized trial. This was 27 individual air medical bases to 9 participating trauma centers. They had to have hypotension or severe hypotension. Now, this was a cluster randomized trial. So it wasn't like they had a cooler and they open it up and say, surprise, you're either giving them or not. All the units, all the helicopter people knew exactly which group they were in. They knew if they were giving plasma or not. Okay. So only about 15%, 50%. Some could give pre-hospital red cells. And again, they were either transferred from the injury site or outside. They evaluated a good number of patients. They included 500. And again, there was minimal dropout. So the big issue here is the cluster randomization. So they mentioned these issues in the discussion, so they're open. But first of all, there are separate consort guidelines for these trials because they are not blinded. So a cluster is usually used when you can't blind. So for example, let's say I started putting up posters in my hospital saying, wash your hands, okay? Obviously, they're in the hospital. The posters are everywhere, so you can't have certain people not look at the posters and others look at it. So that's why you need clusters. So one hospital would have the posters, one hospital wouldn't. But for this trial, yeah, it makes it easier, but this is a trial where really you need blinding. So the medics knew which group patients were in. And what was interesting, so it's much easier to enroll someone in a study when you don't have to do anything, right? I'm just doing standard of care. I can enroll everybody into that study. So you would think it's much easier to enroll people. And they use but again, there could be bias there on who you enroll. So they try to use multivariable analysis, but there are limitations for that. And normally in a randomized trial, other randomized trials, you often don't need to do that. So again, if they knew their group and they believed it was futile even to give a unit of plasma, it's easier to enroll in the standard of care, right? So actually more were enrolled in the standard of care group, which again and again, there were differences in sites in terms of how many they enrolled. So that's also an interesting question. Why is that the case? But the bottom line is I'm still worried. Were the people who got no pre-hospital transfusion sicker and the medics simply believed transfusion was futile as the patient was going to die? And they didn't die because they didn't receive a pre-hospital transfusion. They died because I didn't want to enroll them when I could give them plasma. So they were more likely to enroll sicker patients in the no pre-hospital transfusion group because it was easier. Okay. So mortality at 30 days was the outcome. They had, 88% power to detect a 14 percentage point difference. Most patients received the 2 units of pre-hospital. So when you look at comparing the 2 groups, there were actually some differences. So the use of pre-hospital red cells and the saline volume. Saline volume might make sense because they weren't getting the plasma, but look at that difference between pre-hospital red cell transfusion, right? So again, there might be other unmeasured confounders that we don't know about because again, it wasn't blinded. So that's a big red flag. So primary outcome did show a benefit for giving the plasma beforehand. And there wasn't really much difference in the secondary outcomes, nothing really worth talking about. So looking at this study, well, it's consistent with the cohort study, not with the other randomized trial. Most did receive pre-hospital transfusion of 2 units, so no real dose response to look at there. Again, how did 2 bags of plasma make any difference? I mean, the bottom line is if you don't have any red cells, it's going to kill you. So plasma seems less of an issue. It was a large study. They had a decent p-value, and they did try to control for differences. But again, a key issue here is the cluster randomization. It is not really a blinded trial, and we have that issue of futility again. easier to enroll someone. You knew up front which group you were in, and also it was easier to enroll if you didn't have to give plasma. So it was easier to enroll potentially sicker patients. While if I was giving plasma, I can just say, I'm not even going to bother entering them in the study because I don't want to waste the plasma. Okay, so a couple of red flags there. So this is just an editorial that came out about low group O whole blood for pre-hospital shock. So North we cannot refuse. I honestly believe it is something we can refuse, at least at this point. And again, I might change my opinion with more data, but I don't think we're there. And if people haven't seen, there's the refill study, and you guys can take a look at that and see what it adds to this, because I think it's a very important study and helps put these studies even in greater perspective. Okay, I'm just going to go through a few other sort of red flags of studies in the trauma literature. So this is where it all began, this idea of one-to-one plasma or giving a lot of plasma up front and pre-hospital transfusion. It was this study in the Journal of Trauma. And what you can see, first of all, no one's going to recommend 1 to 8, 8 red cells to 1 bag of plasma. However, I wouldn't expect that much of a difference between 1 to 2.5 and 1 to 1.4. But there were huge differences in death, okay? Does anyone know what the major issue with these studies, looking at people who received more plasma, did better? These observational studies?
Yeah, people are very familiar with this. So there's a lot of answers coming in here quick. There's more time to get plasma if you're alive, survival bias, futility bias.
Right. So survival bias. And this is from Dr. Callum. So you have someone who's incredibly sick, and of course, you're going to pop red cells into them first. So they die before you can give them plasma. The person who isn't as sick lives longer and lives long enough to get plasma. And in fact, there was this great study, a follow-up study. Oh, shoot, I didn't put the reference, I don't think. Oh, no, the reference is down there. You know, before they controlled for survival bias, oh my gosh, more plasma was better. Control for it, the advantage goes away. And in fact, there was a whole review done at that time, which basically showed that, there's a huge issue with survival bias in these studies. So of course, what we needed was a randomized trial. And, that's what they say without randomized trials. So then there was the proper, which I believe is a negative study. It was well designed, again, 1-to-1 versus 1-to-2. And there was no difference in the primary outcome, mortality. But there was a difference in the percent achieving hemostasis. And also, there were lower numbers of people who died from exsanguination. So I'll just say what my problem with this is. I don't care what you died of or whether you achieved hemostasis, because it doesn't matter if you are dead. Plus, there's that whole issue with secondary outcomes, right? I can just do enough. And what's really interesting is achieving hemostasis was not listed as a secondary outcome in the methods, right? So again, time 2 is listed, but that was not significant. So this has all the flavor of p-hacking and trying to find a variable where I can get a low p-value. And it also, with the causes of death, there was a lot of overlap. They might say they died of exsanguination, but some of those also had traumatic brain injury. So it's hard to say what they died of. And the people in 1-to-1 got more transfusions. Also, anyone who says this shows at least it's not harmful, it's not correct. It wasn't powered to detect harms. So the bottom line is everyone pushing for 1-to-1, there's a randomized trial showing it doesn't make a difference between 1-to-2. And just with whole blood, it's really quite a mixed bag. I probably don't have time to go through. I'll just go through this quickly. So this was a study of 2,000 non-whole blood and 400 in the whole blood group. It was a cohort. And they said there was a survival benefit. The problem is, basically, why were there 5-fold more patients in the non-whole blood group than the whole blood group? Selection bias. And you can look at the two groups. The Glasgow Coma score was a lot higher in the whole blood than in the non-whole blood. So do people say, oh, this isn't even worth me giving whole blood, so I'm not even going to give it. Also, so there were a lot of differences between these groups, and you can't just change apples into oranges. Okay. Also, having 1 unit of whole blood save someone's life and have such a dramatic. The median units was 1 with an interquartile range of 1 to 1. So again, a lot of issues with this study. Here was another recent paper with whole blood. This was all patients coming into an ED, and they looked at 2 time periods, and they didn't have a survival benefit. The main issue with this study is 2 issues. There are 2 different time periods, which may mean differences in care. And they didn't control for confounders. So that's really difficult to interpret an observational study if you don't control for confounders. So even though I believe that whole blood doesn't really have a benefit, this study has some issues with making that interpretation. It also wasn't specifically looking at trauma. So, there were a decent number of trauma patients, but you could argue trauma could be different in some way, even though I don't necessarily believe that either. Okay, so that was sort of the toolkit, the review of trauma studies. The last thing I want to talk about is unconscious bias. Race is enmeshed in transfusion medicine. You can go to the FAQs for blood donors on the AB website. It lists ABO by race: Hispanic, Asian, Black, etc. Here's a paper that came out in the New York Times, or an article. Blood can be racially or ethnically specific. The quote that opens is from a donor center leader in England who says, "We need Black blood." Well, guess what? This stuff has gotten the attention of historians and other people. And I love this quote: "A tireless time traveler and agile shapeshifter, the blood race equation is back, clothed in the good intentions of sickle cell awareness month blood drive. We need Black blood." So again, this is a complex issue. I'm just saying it's something we really need to think about. And because race is not a biological construct, okay? It was developed to promote superiority of one group over another. Skin color does not predict characteristics such as intelligence. And genetics is a hell of a lot more complicated than looking at someone's skin, okay? Most of our current belief in race is based on skull sizes. Okay, and there's a great book by Stephen Jay Gould who talks about how the race concept came up and these studies that should supposedly show truth. Things like intelligence and race, how they're incredibly biased and poor studies. So race is not genetic, it's not biological, it's sociopolitical. And actually, genetic studies have shown there's more diversity between so-called races than between races. Leads to bad medicine. Okay. So we shouldn't ignore race. There are huge healthcare disparities, at least in the United States, related to biases in people of different, people look at the color of someone's skin, and there are biases, both unconscious and conscious, that lead to healthcare issues. So I'm not saying ignore, but here's an example. So this was a review about giving incompatible plasma. And they wrote approximately 85% of patients would be either group A or group O, for which A plasma would be compatible. So what they're saying is, if I just give A plasma up front to everyone instead of AB, I'm only going to be affecting 15% of people. Anyone see a problem with this?
The white population lens, more Blacks or group B are common.
Right. So again, acknowledging there are different, we shouldn't use, race as a biological thing, but the bottom line is they talk about the quote unquote Caucasian population, and there are other people of other genetic ancestries besides European that have a group B or AB can be up to 30%. So this is really ignored. And I'm not saying the people who wrote this are racist, but it shows how we were trained in blood banking. There's so much talking about race and antigen frequencies, we lose the big picture about what's going on. And I recommend, there's these great guidelines that were published in JAMA. So we're talking about biases. Look at these guidelines to see how you're handling issues of ethnicity and race in your papers. For example, if you have categories for race and ethnicity, say why you're doing it. Don't just do it because, think about, do I really need this data? Also, this again, I don't mean to be like, micromanage or be too picky, but just the actual word Caucasian has this huge history where basically this guy named Blumenbach in the late 1700s, the most beautiful skull in his collection was from the Caucasus Mountains. So he said that is the most beautiful race, the white race, because this skull is so beautiful, and people in that region are white. So so that's how Caucasian came back. It's based on the pseudoscience of skull size and racist biology. So if you have an opportunity, don't use Caucasian. Use the term white if you need to. Okay, so that was just, again, it was a whirlwind tour, but I hope gave you a couple of tools to think about, and then how to apply them. And we looked through the trauma literature, and then also thinking about questions of race and ethnicity. It's a different type of bias that can be in studies, but it's just as important to be aware of. And there are some guidelines you can look at to help with that. So anyway, that's all I have, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Rich, that was really, really fantastic and helpful. And
Thanks.
I'm sure there are going to be many questions. If I could just jump right in here, taking prerogative as the MC here. You have sort of you created this analogy in my mind, between sort of the wrong blood and tube problem we have with samples coming to the blood bank, and kind of the wrong paper and journal problem that you're talking about here. We have these mechanisms by which, we are very persnickety about receiving samples to make sure that, the signature is there, that the data is done properly. There's that little mistakes, we have zero tolerance for, because they reflect the presence of much larger errors underneath, and I think you've kind of made a good point here, that these little red flags that we see in journals, that often reflect major problems in the way the paper was written, or even the trial was designed, and we should therefore, be on guard to catch those. But in terms of sort of what we want this lecture series to do, what we're trying to do here is create a research community for transfusion medicine in Canada, where we don't create crappy papers. We don't want to be the people who are generating these things. And I'm trying to think, just as we have this sort of zero tolerance policy for, labeling mistakes on tubes, really we need to sort of understand what is driving that, that workaround, that cheating, and I think with sample collection, it's because it's faster, to do it the wrong way. You save time. And with research, I think, probably it's that little dopamine hit that we are all familiar with when you see that p-value come up when you do your stats, and you want that hit so badly, especially when you have a predetermined sense of what you want the answer to be, and that went right into the original design of the trial. It's very hard to kind of just say, be better, don't want that dopamine hit, don't want that kind of thing. And I'm just thinking, is there like a larger structural problem in the way in which we do research? And I'm just thinking where we generally ask the most junior person on the team to write the original draft of the paper, sort of career development, and then that is reviewed by the senior author, who is the person who wanted the study done in the first place, who wanted the question. In a sense, we are actively encouraging mistakes with that process, by having papers written that way. Is there a better way? Are you familiar with research collaboratives where questions are generated, papers are written and reviewed in such a way that there's not this huge incentive to commit these kind of errors?
Well, it's a really good question. I don't think, again, the people who are writing these papers are evil, right? It's like you said, there are biases. I think it starts with the fact that, my training in medical school on this was like, it was a month maybe, and explaining what a t-test was. There's really not teaching how to critically evaluate. And the same thing, those same people like me are now reviewing papers and don't have that idea. So I think the best model is like what they do for PhD, like graduate work. Okay. So you have the environment you create. Like when we did a journal club in graduate school, the goal was to rip apart a paper. It wasn't to just be like, oh, this is great. And what I've noticed, like sometimes that was a more PhD focused group. When I've been in MD groups, it's more like a PowerPoint presentation. Like, here's a paper, here's it. You want to encourage an environment where you can tear things apart to learn and to encourage that. So I think when you look at the graduate school, there's more of that idea that we're going to tear each other apart in a nice way with the idea. So we have to understand that getting that feedback is very critical. And I think, especially if the best place to get that, and again, because you have intrinsic bias, we all have them, because you have this collaborative here, have someone read your study design or your paper that isn't involved in it, right? Have someone else in this group read it, because that's going to be a good way. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, I send out my papers for other people to read to make sure I'm not missing something. I mean, you want to do it, but teaching people how to critically review, encouraging that critical review, and then having other people outside before you submit, or you're going to start on something. I think those are sort of the key steps. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're describing kind of a journal club environment right at the cradle of the study design,
Yes.
didn't pick it apart, even as, I guess the trick is to do that without, scaring people out of the idea of doing
Yeah,
it.
no, and obviously I say rip it apart. I'm being kind of facetious. The
Right,
idea is
right,
people need, you don't want to say, oh yeah, you should have used and here, or something,
right.
the idea is that people feel comfortable giving it's like feedback with anything else. We talk about it all the time in medical education. People need to be comfortable with receiving feedback, and the feedback has to be given in a nice way, right? It shouldn't be the study sucks, right? But it's creating that environment where people feel comfortable talking about things and giving them practice, having a journal club where they can practice those skills,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? You're having abundant praise showered upon you in the chat section.
Oh, well, yeah, that's no, I appreciate that. It's very nice.
Okay. All right. Well, we're a little bit over time anyway, but we'll sign off there. Harley, if you're on, or Amy, if you could just circulate that feedback link, for we can provide that to Rich, either in the chat or by email, that would be great. And with that, we can adjourn. Okay.
Thank
Really
you
appreciate
so
it.
much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Bye,
This is a
everybody.
great group. I mean, what you're trying to do is awesome. Thanks.